I used to think silence was weakness, that keeping your dignity when the world wants you to scream was the same as surrender. But I was wrong about that. I was wrong about so many things back then. Back when I still believed that being a good wife meant erasing yourself piece by piece until there was nothing left but the shape he wanted you to hold. I remember the exact moment I realized my marriage was a performance I'd been giving for an audience of one who wasn't even watching anymore. It was a Tuesday morning. Nothing dramatic. Just him at the breakfast table scrolling through his phone while I poured coffee into the cup he'd left at the edge, where I'd have to reach across him to avoid spilling it. A small thing. Such a small thing. But I saw it clearly then. How every surface in that house had been arranged for his comfort and my efficient movement through the spaces he allowed me. I set the pot down and walked out of the room, and he didn't even notice, didn't look up, didn't ask where I was going, and I thought this is what it means to be invisible while still doing all the work of being seen. The divorce took 11 months, and in that time, I watched myself become a different kind of invisible. The kind where people look right at you and decide you're finished, used up, a cautionary tale they can tell at dinner parties about what happens when you don't hold on tight enough. His mother called me selfish, can you imagine? After 18 years of her son coming home to clean sheets and meals he never thanked me for, after I'd sat through her stories about his childhood that always ended with some pointed comment about how patient she'd been, how understanding, implying, of course, that I was neither, she called me selfish for wanting to leave, as if wanting to breathe was an act of aggression against the family I'd served, like it was my religion. And maybe it had been. Maybe I'd made a god out of being good enough and spent 2 decades worshiping at an altar no one else could even see. What they don't tell you about divorce is how quiet it makes your life afterward. How people stop calling not because they've chosen sides exactly, but because you remind them that marriages end, that the life they're building might also be a house of cards. I became a kind of ghost in my own social circle, still invited to things occasionally, but always with this air of charity. Like they were doing me a favor by including the sad divorced woman in her late 40s who'd probably just sit in the corner anyway. And I did sit in corners at first. I won't pretend I didn't. I sat and I watched, and I learned things about the people I'd called friends for years. I learned who had always thought I wasn't quite good enough for their circle, who had stayed close only because of my husband's position at the firm, who had built their own marriages on the same foundation of quiet erasure and resented me for escaping. You can see so much from the corners, things people don't realize they're showing you. I took a job at a library, which everyone thought was beneath me. I'd had a career before the marriage, nothing spectacular but respectable, project management for a consulting firm, but I'd left it when he got his promotion and we moved, and somehow 18 years passed and going back seemed impossible. Too much had changed. I'd changed. Or maybe I'd just stopped pretending to be whoever that woman was. So I took the library job, and people actually said things like, well, at least you're keeping busy. As if being busy was the participation trophy they handed out to women who'd failed at the only thing that mattered. But I loved that library, loved the silence of it. The way people came in looking for answers in books because the world outside had stopped making sense. I understood that. I'd been looking for answers too, just not the kind you could find indexed in the card catalog. There was a regular patron, elderly man named Richard, came in every Thursday like clockwork to read the newspapers from other cities. He said it helped him remember the world was bigger than his losses. His wife had died 2 years before, and he was teaching himself to be alone without becoming lonely. And one day he said something that cracked me open. He said, "You know what I miss most? It's not the big things. It's that she used to hum while she did the dishes, just these little fragments of songs, and I never told her I loved that. I wish I'd told her." And I realized my ex-husband couldn't tell you a single thing I hummed or if I ever did. Couldn't tell you how I took my coffee even though I'd made his the same way for 18 years. We'd lived together and known nothing about each other. We'd been strangers performing a script someone else wrote about what marriage should look like. 6 months after the divorce was final, I heard through someone's carefully casual mention that he'd gotten engaged. Quick work, I thought. But then I did the math and realized it had been going on much longer than that. Probably years. Possibly the entire time I'd been pouring his coffee and wondering why I felt like I was disappearing. And the strangest thing was I didn't feel betrayed exactly. I felt vindicated. Proof that I'd been right to leave. proof that the marriage had been a museum of something that died long before I'd admitted it. But other people didn't see it that way. Other people saw a man who'd moved on, and a woman who was clearly bitter about it. I could see it in how they watched me when his name came up, waiting for me to crack, to say something ugly they could repeat later as evidence of my instability. I didn't crack. I did something they found much more unsettling. I stayed calm. I wished him well when people fished for reactions. I meant it too. Genuinely hoped he'd be happy because his unhappiness was no longer my responsibility and that freedom was worth more than any revenge I could imagine. But people don't trust that kind of peace. They think you're hiding something, performing again. They can't fathom that you might actually be fine. Better than fine. Learning to live in a way you never could when you were trying to fold yourself small enough to fit someone else's idea of who you should be. Then things got strange. About a year after the divorce, I started noticing money missing from my account. Small amounts at first, $50 here, $30 there. Enough to notice, but not enough to panic about. I thought maybe I'd made errors. I'd never been good with numbers. That's what he always said anyway. So I double-checked everything, started keeping records, and the discrepancies kept appearing. Someone had access they shouldn't have had. I changed my passwords, updated my security questions, and for a few weeks it stopped. But then I got a call from a credit card company about an account I'd never opened. They were very polite about the $15,000 in charges, very understanding when I explained I hadn't made them. These things happen, they said. Identity theft is so common now. And I felt this cold weight settle in my stomach because I knew exactly whose identity had been stolen and by whom. I didn't go to the police right away. I know I should have. But I needed to be sure, needed to understand the scope of it before I made accusations I couldn't take back. So I hired someone, a forensic accountant recommended by a lawyer I'd consulted during the divorce, and what she found was methodical, sophisticated. Accounts opened in my name going back almost 3 years. Credit cards, small loans, even a business registered under my Social Security number. Shell companies layered so carefully it looked legitimate until you examined the timing, the addresses, the digital fingerprints, and every single thread led back to him, or more precisely to someone he'd paid to do it for him. I had documentation, emails recovered from servers he thought he'd wiped. And I sat with all of it spread across my kitchen table and felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, something colder and more patient. The thing about being underestimated your whole life is you learn to use it. People think quiet means stupid, think nice means weak. They forget that you've been watching them all along, learning their patterns, understanding how they think. I knew my ex-husband. Knew he'd gotten sloppy because he thought I'd never figure it out. Thought I was too trusting or too stupid or too broken by the divorce to notice. And maybe the woman I'd been during our marriage wouldn't have noticed. But I wasn't her anymore. I'd shed that skin in the library silence, in the corners of rooms where I'd watched and learned. I'd become someone he didn't recognize and couldn't predict. I could have gone to the police then, handed them everything, watched him get arrested, but that felt too quick, too public, too much like a story everyone would pick apart and find ways to blame me for. No. Instead, I did something that required more patience than I knew I had. I started cleaning it up quietly, disputing the charges, closing the accounts, rebuilding my credit score point by point. And while I did that, I watched him. Not physically, but through the traces we all leave in the digital world. Social media posts, professional updates, mentions in local business news. And I saw how he was building something, a consultancy, prestigious clients, a reputation as someone innovative and trustworthy, all of it funded by money he'd stolen from me. All of it built on a foundation of fraud he thought I'd never expose. 2 years after the divorce, I was having coffee with a woman I barely knew. Friend of a friend. She worked in corporate compliance, and we'd been introduced at some forgettable gathering. And she mentioned casually that her firm was looking into hiring his consultancy for a major project. Millions of dollars in contracts. And I felt my heart start beating faster because I understood then what I was going to do. I told her very carefully that she should probably run a thorough background check. Mentioned I'd heard some concerning things about financial irregularities. Nothing specific, just enough to plant doubt. And then I let it go. trusted that people who work in compliance are paid to be suspicious, paid to dig, and if they dug deep enough, they'd find what I'd found. They did dig. Of course they did. Because I'd made sure to leave breadcrumbs in public records, disputed charges that created patterns, credit reports that showed inconsistencies. Nothing that pointed directly at him, but everything that would make a careful investigator curious, and what they found was a man who'd committed identity theft, fraud, built a business on stolen money, and suddenly the wedding to his new wife that had been planned for that spring was postponed, and the big contract vanished, and people started asking questions he couldn't answer without admitting what he'd done. I never spoke to him directly about any of it, never had to. The truth did that work for me, which is the thing people don't understand about revenge. Real revenge isn't violence or confrontation. It's patience. It's understanding that lies eventually eat themselves from the inside out. All you have to do is make sure the right people start looking, and then you step back and let consequences unfold the way they always do when someone's built their life on fraud. I didn't destroy him. I just stopped protecting him from himself. The strange thing is, I ran into his mother about 6 months after everything fell apart for him. In a grocery store of all places, mundane and awkward, and she looked at me with these watery eyes and said, "You must be very satisfied." Like I'd orchestrated some elaborate takedown, and I told her honestly that I wasn't satisfied or unsatisfied. I was just living my life. That her son had made choices, and those choices had consequences, and none of that had anything to do with me anymore. And I think that's what really disturbed her. Not that I'd hurt him, but that I genuinely didn't care. That I'd moved so far past our marriage that his destruction barely registered as relevant to my life. Because here's what I'd learned in those quiet years after the divorce. The years people thought I was finished, I learned that peace isn't something you find. It's something you build in the ruins of whatever you used to think you needed. I learned that being alone isn't the same as being lonely if you actually like the person you're alone with. I learned that society's definitions of success and failure are marketing campaigns designed to keep you buying solutions to problems you don't actually have. And most importantly, I learned that the best revenge is becoming someone so fundamentally different from who they thought you were that they can't recognize you anymore, can't predict you, can't control the narrative about who you are and what you're capable of. I still work at the library, still sit in corners at parties when I bother going, which isn't often because I've realized I don't actually enjoy most social gatherings. I enjoy quiet dinners with the few people who knew me before I became whoever I was supposed to be. I enjoy my small apartment with its plants and its silence, and its complete lack of anyone else's expectations. I enjoy waking up on Saturday mornings with no plan except to drink coffee slowly and read or walk or do nothing at all. And when people ask if I'm dating, if I'm looking for someone, I tell them I'm not looking for anything. I'm already here, already whole, already exactly where I want to be. And they look at me with this mixture of pity and confusion because they can't imagine that a woman alone could actually be content, could actually prefer this to the performance of partnership. My ex-husband lost everything in the end. Not because I destroyed him, but because he destroyed himself, and I simply stopped covering for him the way I'd done unconsciously our entire marriage, the way so many women do, smoothing over the rough edges, making excuses, maintaining the image while the reality rots underneath. His new wife left him when the money problems became public. The business collapsed. He had to move back in with his mother, that same mother who called me selfish. And I heard about all of this through the gossip network that had once excluded me. And I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not pity, just this distant recognition that we'd both become exactly who we were always going to be once we stopped pretending for each other. Sometimes I think about that Tuesday morning, the coffee pot, the phone, the moment I realized I'd become invisible, and I understand now that I was already leaving then. Already halfway out the door. I just didn't have the language for it yet. Didn't have permission from myself to want more than I'd been told I deserved. The divorce wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning. The first time I'd chosen myself in a life built entirely around choosing everyone else first. And yes, it was terrifying. Yes, I lost people I thought were friends. Yes, there were nights I wondered if I'd made a catastrophic mistake. But those nights got fewer and farther between until they disappeared entirely, replaced by mornings where I woke up and remembered I didn't have to be anyone but myself. The library regular, Richard, died last year. Peaceful passing, they said. In his sleep, and at his funeral, his daughter told me he'd mentioned me in his last weeks. Said I reminded him that it was possible to survive loss and build something real from what remained. And I cried then. Not sad tears exactly, but overwhelmed ones. Because I realized he'd taught me the same thing, that grief and peace could coexist. That you could miss what you'd lost and still be grateful it was gone. That the shape of your life could change completely, and you could change with it instead of breaking. And his daughter gave me something he'd left for me. A bookmark with a quote from Rumi that said, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." And I laughed because, of course, he'd leave me something so perfectly on point. So true it hurt. I keep that bookmark in whatever book I'm reading, move it forward page by page, and sometimes I think about the woman I was. The one who poured coffee and stayed quiet and thought that was love. And I don't hate her or pity her. I just recognize that she did the best she could with what she understood then. And when she finally understood something different, she had the courage to walk away, to become this version instead. The one who sits in libraries and learns things, who lives in a small apartment filled with her own choices, who doesn't need anyone to validate her existence because she's finally validated it herself. And if that makes me finished in society's eyes, then I'm finished. I'm complete. I'm whole in a way I never was when I was performing wholeness for an audience that was never going to applaud anyway. The thing nobody tells you about quiet justice is how quiet it actually is. There's no dramatic courtroom scene. No moment where everyone realizes you were right all along. There's just time passing and truth emerging and consequences finding the people who earned them, and you standing somewhere else entirely, far enough away that their downfall is just weather happening in a place you used to live. Interesting to note, but no longer relevant to your forecast. And maybe that's the real victory. Not that he fell, but that I'd already climbed out before the collapse. Not that I won, but that I stopped playing a game I was never going to win because the rules were designed to keep me losing. I'm 51 now, which people still say in that particular tone like it's an apology. Like I should be sorry for aging, for taking up space, for not being young and available and eager to please. But I've stopped apologizing for existing, stopped performing gratitude for the bare minimum of human respect. I exist. I take up space. I have opinions and boundaries and days where I don't want to smile at strangers who tell me I should smile more. And the freedom of that, of just being instead of constantly becoming whatever someone else needs, that's worth more than any revenge I could have planned, any punishment I could have inflicted. Because the punishment was never about him anyway. It was about me learning that I deserved better than what I'd accepted, and once you learn that, once you really integrate it into your bones, everything else just falls away like dead weight you didn't realize you were carrying. So yes, I was finished. Finished being small. Finished being quiet in the wrong ways. Finished building my life around someone else's comfort. And from those ashes, I built this. A life so completely mine that nobody else could claim any part of it. And when I see the women who pitied me, who thought divorce was the worst thing that could happen to a woman my age, I see them still performing, still exhausted, still wondering when they'll be allowed to want something just for themselves. And I want to tell them it's not allowed. You have to take it. You have to decide you matter even when everyone around you says you don't. But you can't tell people that. They have to discover it themselves. Have to reach their own Tuesday morning with the coffee pot and the phone and the sudden terrible clarity that this is not enough. And it never will be. And I hope they do. I hope they all do. I hope they all become finished in the best possible way. Complete and whole and utterly themselves, living in the quiet victory of a life nobody else gets to define.